Welcome to Sam Weller. Oh, no. I see a lot of new faces here. Welcome to Benchmark Books. We're very happy to have you with us tonight for this special occasion. Unless you all just happen to coincidentally come and wanted to visit. But we're going to have a great evening tonight with our two special guest authors, Terryl and Matt Groh. We just coincidentally have written a book together, so it's going to work out really well. How many have never been to Benchmark Books before? Well, I'm not sure if that's really good or if that's bad. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad you discovered us. There's been a fair amount of attention given to this event in some of the blogs and in the media, and we're glad that the word got around, and we're very happy to have you with us. For those of you who don't know, Benchmark Books, we will be celebrating our 25th year next year, believe it or not. I was about 10 when we started, and so we're excited. We've been around a long time. We're still undiscovered by many, which is what we're trying to correct, and so we succeeded with a few of you tonight. We specialize primarily in Mormon-related books, used, out of print, new, and also even rare books. And I'm going to actually show you a couple of things tonight that kind of go along with the subject matter of this book. But we have an extensive book, out-of-print book search service. So if you're looking for an out-of-print LDS book or Utah-related, there's a really good chance that we can find it for you. From within a minute or two to up to, what's our record?
25 years.
25 years. We actually filled a 25-year-old request, again, when I was about 10 years old. So we never give up. We keep looking for those books for you. But it's our privilege from time to time to have authors come and share with us their work. And I like to tell people that we're very picky about who we have come and speak. There are many bookstores that have signings every week. We don't have nearly that many. So we like to concentrate on those authors that have something important to say in the area generally of Mormon history, biography, and doctrine. And so we have two of the best here with us tonight. And I'm soon going to turn the time over to them. I do need to mention that this is being filmed. Let's see, I think we've got CNN, and it is being filmed. I think we're going to be able to put this up on YouTube. So if you miss part of it, you can watch it later. So if you're uncomfortable in any way on being on camera, just so you're aware that it is being filmed and recorded. We will go until about 7 o'clock with the authors speaking about this book, and we're going to give you plenty of time for questions and answers, and they like to respond to those things, so don't hesitate. Be thinking of some good questions, good thoughtful questions. And we will, at that point, allow you, since some of you just got here, to come, and we have various titles by the authors that are available for sale. So if you would, upon the conclusion of the oral part of this tonight, if you could come up and make your purchases, and then they will be available to sign those books for you. I wanted to, obviously the main book that we're featuring tonight is Parley Pratt, the Apostle Paul of Mormonism. And but this is not the only work done by these authors. I don't know if this is going to be, if I'm getting out of the range of the camera there. I hadn't thought about that. But I wanted to just show you quickly some of the other books. The most recent title by Terryl Givens before this one is When Souls Had Wings, Premortal Existence in Western Thought, and that's also published by Oxford, who is the publisher of the Parley P. Pratt biography. He's done a number of other books, and we have them here. People of Paradox, A History of Mormon Culture. The Book of Mormon, A Very Short Introduction. I was going to apologize to Terryl because I still haven't read all of the Parley P. Pratt biography, and I have to confess I'm waiting for it to come out in the Very Short Introduction series. I actually, this is both a compliment and a caveat, I guess. I fell asleep reading the book last night, but the good news is it was at 1 a.m. and I just couldn't stay awake anymore. It had nothing to do with the content. It's a fine book. It's an important book. A couple of comments by critics who took a look at the book. Daniel Walker Howe said, the author's fascinating narratives of Pratt's worldwide adventures, multiple marriages, and eventual murder will make this book welcome not only in the academic community, but among all those with an interest in early Mormon history. Lori Maffley-Kipp said, for anyone seeking to understand the development of early Mormonism, Parley P. Pratt is essential reading. Givens and Grow provide an engaging, thoughtful, and thorough assessment of his significance in the foundations of the Mormon faith. Just very, come on in. Very quickly, Terryl Givens is professor of literature and religion at the University of Richmond, and as I mentioned, has authored a number of important books. He was also frequently quoted in the PBS documentary The Mormons, done by Helen Whitney back in 2007, so a lot of you probably got familiar with Terryl there, and is one of the leading lights in Mormon studies today. Matthew Grow is currently Director of Publications in the Church History Department of the LDS Church. Was former assistant professor at the University of Southern Indiana. And so I'm going to turn the time over to them now. Just one last thing. I wanted to see if, are there any descendants here of Parley P. Pratt? And now I want to see, are there any descendants of Hector McQueen? We wanted you to sit on opposite sides. That's great. I'm glad we got some descendants here. That's makes it even better. Just one last thing really quick. I thought you might get a kick out of this. In the book, they talk about the publications of Parley P. Pratt, who of course was an incredibly important pamphleteer and early systematizer of Mormon doctrine. Had an enormous influence doctrinally in many ways. But the earliest book of Mormon poetry is The Millennium and Other Poems by Parley P. Pratt, published in 1840. This is an original first edition of that book. Another incredibly important book that he did was The Key to the Science of Theology, published in 1855. This is a first edition of that book. Coincidentally, these books are for sale. And this is an 1847 edition of A Voice of Warning, another brilliant missionary tract that Parley P. Pratt wrote that is enormously important in the early missionary efforts of the church. And even when I went on my mission in, what was it, 2000, that we were reading A Voice of Warning still, and probably its jillionth edition by then, but a very important book. Parley P. Pratt had an enormous influence, and they're going to tell us about that. And I'd like to now turn the time over to Matt Groh and Terryl Gibbons. And thank you again for coming.
Wow, well thanks for coming, and we appreciate that Doug is going to give us our choice of the Pratt books to choose from later. Very kind. So we just want to talk for a few minutes, leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. I wanted to talk first of all why we made the comparison with the Apostle Paul, and then a little bit about the relationship of the biography and the autobiography. So obviously there's huge differences between Paul and Parley, but we made that comparison for three principal reasons. Well, maybe a fourth, to sell books. But the three intellectual reasons were that in early Christianity it was Paul's writings, 13 of the 27 canonical New Testament books, that systematized and popularized the teachings of early Christianity. And it's our argument that Parley Pratt plays the same role in early Mormonism, that his newspaper articles, his pamphlets, his books explore the implications of Joseph Smith's revelations in the Book of Mormon, clarifying and expanding key Latter-day Saint doctrines, everything from the physicality of God, the materiality of the universe, the domesticity of heaven, and the possibilities of the divinity of humanity. So in all of these areas and so many more, it was really Parley Pratt's writings that helped systematize, clarify, and popularize the early teachings. And his writings ranged across so many genres. I mean, he wrote poetry, he wrote apologetics, he wrote fiction, he wrote a play, he wrote history, and he wrote theology. And of course it was those two books, one at the beginning of his career and one at the end, that played the most decisive role. And those were A Voice of Warning in 1837, which proved exceptionally popular as a missionary tract, and then A Key to the Science of Theology, which was really the first book to attempt a comprehensive exposition of Mormon theology. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that, like Paul's extensive missionary travels, Pratt's missionary travels helped put his movement on the path from a small sect to a worldwide religion. Paul primarily did his missionary work in the large cities of the northern Mediterranean, and like that, Pratt's missionary travels were mostly to large cities, to Toronto, to New York City, to Manchester, Liverpool, San Francisco, and Valparaiso, Chile. His converts filled not only Mormonism's rank and file, but also included future leaders like John Taylor. And he plays this really critical role in the expansion and the internationalization of Mormonism. It's Pratt who takes the Mormon gospel first to Canada in a serious way. He then participates in a very critical role in the early English apostolic mission in 1840 to 1842. And then it's as president of basically what's the Pacific mission in the 1850s, in which he's in Gold Rush, San Francisco, goes to Chile, and he's supervising missionaries in Hawaii and Australia and throughout the Pacific. This is the moment in which Mormonism's gaze first turns from Anglo-America to the Pacific, and it's a really critical moment. The third reason is that, like Paul, Parley Pratt reveled in opposition and persecution. And in his own eyes, and in the beliefs of the Latter-day Saints, he met a martyr's death. Writing of the death of his 5-year-old son Nathan in Nauvoo in 1843, Pratt wrote, "He died an infant, but he can say with Paul, in prison oft, and stripes more abundant, in tribulations and persecutions, in perils by the sea and land, in perils among robbers, and among false brethren, and in travels more abundant." Parley Pratt saw himself the same way. Imprisoned for 8 months in Missouri as a consequence of his participation in a battle between Missourians and Mormons, and held longer than Joseph Smith and any other Latter-day Saint, Pratt compared his prison experience to Paul. And this is just a constant theme in his life, this idea of persecution, of opposition. And it's not only that he sees himself as the object of persecution, but that he helps establish through his writings, particularly his historical writings of the Mormon experience in Missouri, the identity of Latter-day Saints as the people who are forged in persecution. And that identity, of course, becomes so central to the Latter-day Saints in the 19th century. Obviously, we're not the first to tell Parley's story. The question that's so commonly asked of us is, he's got this classic autobiography, why do a biography? And obviously, writing about a subject who is a capable autobiographer both facilitates and complicates the biographer's task. And particularly for an autobiographer like Parley Pratt, whose autobiography is still widely read among the Latter-day Saints. And in that book, he establishes himself as the legendary Parley P. Pratt, the trickster of bulldogs, the intrepid missionary, the fearless explorer. And the autobiography is a crucial source for our own book, particularly for the early years when other records are so scarce. But autobiographies, they're a great window onto an individual's motivations, but they can conceal as much as they reveal. And like all autobiographers, Parley Pratt selectively fashioned his history. Right? He's telling the story of how he became the apostle he was in the 1850s. That means that he includes certain things and he leaves certain things out. The issue really isn't one of factual accuracy. We found that the names and dates and people and places in the autobiography are quite accurate. Not completely so, but mostly so. The challenge, rather, is that he's writing it for a particular purpose. Just to give you a couple examples of this, the autobiography is remarkably uneven in its treatment of events. So about a quarter of the autobiography tells those 8 months in prison. Right? And by the time you get to the mid-1840s and through the end of his life, it just trails off into some journal entries and a few letters and that sort of thing. A second thing is that, like other early American autobiographers, such as Benjamin Franklin, Parley largely omitted information on his family life. But his private letters demonstrate great concern and longing for his family when absent, suggesting this abiding tension in Pratt's life between a religion which made family central, but also called him to continually leave his behind in short preaching tours and on long missionary journeys. Central to his identity was this idea that he was a celestial patriarch in the making. Yet the devotion to Mormonism required this kingdom or nothing attitude that required all these absences from his family. So our biography aims to restore Pratt's family life as central as to its central place that it really had. From the monogamous marriage to Thankful Halsey in the late 1820s to the large plural family of Salt Lake City in the 1850s. Finally, I want to just mention a couple of things about how I think our biography maybe changes the story somewhat of early Mormon history. One is about the development of doctrine. Oftentimes, I think Latter-day Saints see this very linear process where doctrine is given to Joseph. It's unfolded step by step. But in Parley's writings, we see this more complicated, even messy way that doctrine is established. That it's oftentimes, and it's hard to tell who is influencing who, because we don't have all those private conversations, but it certainly seems that Parley and others very much influenced the development of early Mormon theology. Just an example of that, Joseph Smith's King Follett discourse, of course, is this great statement about the clear statement of Mormon belief in men becoming divine. But you find that in Parley's writing several years before you find it in Joseph's writings. And so I think there's this give and take, this back and forth to how doctrine establishes between Joseph and other early leaders. A second way that I think we change the story somewhat is we've got two chapters in the middle of the biography that we call Many Mormonisms. And it's about the succession crisis after Joseph's death. And traditionally we've understood that succession crisis from Nauvoo, from headquarters. How Brigham Young and the other apostles established control over most Mormons in that region. But that story really misses what's going on in the hinterland. What's going on in the margins of the Mormon story where probably a majority of Mormons live. And so one of our chapters looks at what's going on in the east, where Parley serves a critical mission. It is It's a story of chaos. It's a story of conflicting reports about plural marriage. It's a story of trying to control the press, to control the message. But I think that's an important component of the story. The other Many Mormonism chapter takes us to England, where the apostles have this long history with the English saints and seem in great position to consolidate their support. But through Wilford Woodruff, the apostles have also given their approval to a joint stock company, which is supposed to bring the English saints to the United States. And the joint stock company is a complete failure. Many of the English saints lose what little money they have in the joint stock operation. So it calls into question the apostles' leadership. And James Strang, who's at this point is the principal opponent to the apostles and the success in crisis, is quick to try to take advantage of that. And so trying to understand the succession story from the hinterlands, Parley and John Taylor and Orson Hyde go to England in a very critical apostolic moment there. I think the other way that I think that we can change somewhat the story of early Mormon history is this idea of Mormonism beginning to shift from an Anglo-American religion, a religion of the United States and England in the 1850s, to a religion which is really taking seriously the Pacific, Latin America, Hawaii, and all of those. And most of the early forays aren't very successful, except for there's some success in Hawaii, but I think it's this critical transition. So those are just a few ideas, maybe, of what the book can hopefully contribute. And I will turn the time to Terryl.
Talk about the 2 or 3 details that Matt left out. He gave an outstanding overview of our project. Let me just say a little bit about how we came to collaborate together on the project, and then I'm just going to say a few things by way of Parley Pratt as a tragic hero, Parley Pratt's legacy, and Parley Pratt's non-legacy. Say a few words about each of those. I came to Parley Pratt primarily out of interest in theology, Mormon theology, and most of my books have dealt with Mormon culture, Mormon thought, the reception history of the Book of Mormon, and it became quite evident to me that Parley Pratt played a tremendously important role, not just in popularizing, but in actually shaping Mormon theology. So I approached Oxford with a proposal for a biography. They were quite happy to accept my proposal. Matt caught wind of my project and asked if I would like a collaborator. I was familiar with his book on Thomas Cain. I knew that he was an exceptional historian and a gifted writer, and it seemed that if we combined my interest and background in intellectual and theological history with his training as a historian, that it would be a fruitful collaboration, and indeed, I think it did turn out to be.
It was a very uncharacteristic moment for me. I mean, I just had graduated from Notre Dame with my doctorate and was working there. And I had great admiration for Terryl and his works, and I heard that he was doing it, and so I sent an email, and then I thought I probably shouldn't have sent that. who emails a leading scholar they don't even know and says, "Hey, you're doing this project, how about I jump in?" Just like I've jumped in right now. So.
But you'll have to judge if I made a good decision or not. I agree that I did. So I'm actually going to, I know we're not doing a book reading tonight, but if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read just a few passages from the epilogue, because I want to talk about Parley Pratt as a tragic hero. And, you know, the more we worked on Pratt, and the more I followed him through his life, both as an observer from the outside, but also having access to his, not just his autobiography, but especially some of his sermons that he delivered in the later years from the Salt Lake Tabernacle. It became clear to me that he was an especially sad figure in many ways. And let me just read a few passages to lead into that topic. Pratt was a product of vigorously competing worldviews, many of which never fully resolved themselves in his tempestuous character. He was a self-made individualist, fervent about Republican ideals, convinced of America's providential role in Christian history. But he came of age in an era when widespread intolerance, frontier violence, and the tyranny of the majority made most of the ideas he associated with his country into a hollow promise. Steeped in a rhetoric of Mormon Zionism, lieutenant in a militia, and zealous to defend the rights of his people, he also aspired to the meekness and gentleness of a disciple and apostle of Jesus Christ. and passionate about the literal fulfillment of prophecy, he both imbibed and exuded a millennial fervor that seamlessly superimposed the words of biblical prophecy onto the world events and local developments of the mid-19th century. The predictions and prophecies of the Book of Mormon, he proclaimed, led him to contemplate future events with all the assurance as if I had seen it myself. At the same time, he lived through the wrenching failure to expel the usurpers who had dispossessed the Mormons of their New Jerusalem, and he adjusted by learning to at least partially spiritualize the meaning of Zion. Like so many of his people, he looked across the River Jordan, but found the Promised Land a more elusive destination than he expected. And I think Pratt never personally recovered from the loss of Zion in particular. The way events converged in his life and around him gave him the absolute certainty that he was going to be the spearhead of this new movement preparing the world for the coming of Christ. He was absolutely convinced that it was imminent. And when Joseph called the Lamanite mission, it seemed a fulfillment both of the prophecies that Pratt himself had read and studied, and of his own personal aspirations to be a missionary to the Red Man, as he called him. And so the fact that the Indian Removal Act had just occurred, that most of the American Indians were being gathered to this land in one centralized location where he could go as a missionary to teach them, he saw all of this as a fulfillment and culmination of these Book of Mormon prophecies about this very event. And if you read some of his descriptions of his encounters with the Indians later in the Utah period, the disillusion that had set in, his sense of frustration and disappointed hope was again it was something that he just never could quite come to terms with in his own life. Let me now just turn to say a few words about his legacy. I say less ambiguous than the meaning of his life and death is the influence he exerted in early Mormonism, and his enduring legacy is the principal expounder and shaper of the doctrines Joseph Smith proclaimed. I don't think I'll say much more because Matt has covered this, but I was especially struck to find that in 1838, Pratt was already not just alluding to, but explicating and defending a doctrine of theosis in his response to some of the attacks of Leroy Sunderland, the editor of Zion's Watchman. And this is 6 years before King Fallen. But one especially interesting example that I don't remember if we even covered in the book. I think we did. But you know, one of the centerpieces of Mormon theology today is the idea that we are literally children of our Heavenly Father, right? That's, primary children learn about this and sing about this. And yet the idea that we are literal spirit offspring of our Heavenly Father is nowhere present in the writings of Joseph Smith. It's completely absent from his theology. His is a conception more of a kind of spirit adoption, right? Where God sees all of these intelligences that eternally existed and invites them into a covenant relationship. But it's within months of Joseph Smith's death that Pratt is transforming that into a slightly altered theology that involves the literal fatherhood of God. His brother Orson then picks that up and elaborates it further. Brigham Young will quote Orson Pratt, and then President Kimball and every prophet in between is quoting Brigham Young, quoting Orson Pratt, borrowing from Parley. So that's just one example of how his views and ideas have infiltrated the very foundations of Mormon theology in a way that very, very few Latter-day Saints are even aware of. Let me just conclude by saying a few words about the non-legacy of Parley Pratt. You know, when I think about the way that Mormonism has been presented to the world or been seen by the world, I divide it into three phases that I call fraud, philandering, and football. From 1830 until 1852, roughly, it's all about fraud, right? The newspapers, the anti-Mormon literature, they're full of accounts of Joseph Smith pretending to translate a Greek psalter, or walking on water, or making up the story of the gold plate. So it's all about fraudulence. With the revelation of plural marriage, it's all about lust and lasciviousness, right? Philandry. And then in 1893, something very significant happens. In 1893, we have the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And two diametrically opposed things happen at the same time. On the one hand, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir enters the great choral competition. And lo and behold, they effectively win it, right? But they're given the silver, because you can't really give Mormons a gold medal, right? Even in 1893. But he's going to give them the silver. And from that day to the present, right, now we're dancing with the stars and we're, you know, produce all the, you know, the leading NFL quarterbacks. And so that's what I mean about football is we are a culturally accepted phenomenon. But at the same time in 1893, out of the entire array of world religions, Christian and non-Christian, invited to the World Parliament of Religions in conjunction with that Columbian Exposition, only the Mormon faith is excluded from representation. So B.H. Roberts and others launch a protest. They eventually convince the First Presidency of the Church that it's something worth fighting for. The organizers change their mind, and they allow B.H. Roberts to come and make a presentation. But just a day or two before he's actually to make his presentation, they reverse themselves again and say, no, you can't. And they eventually say, well, you can if you do it in a little small assembly room off of an alley away from the main venue, right? And he refuses to do that, and rightly so. So what that represents is simultaneously the acceptance of Mormonism, as I said, as a cultural entity, and the utter rejection of Mormonism insofar as they represent a theological system, right? Reed Nielsen has done a wonderful study of this. It's going to be coming out fairly soon on it's the story of the Mormon involvement in the Columbian Exposition. And Mormonism, by and large, has been content with that compromise ever since, right? We'll see in this election cycle how well that compromise holds up. But Parley represented another direction the church might have taken. If you think about the Articles of Faith, it's as if from the very beginning Joseph Smith himself is trying to negotiate this tightrope, right, between celebrating Mormon exceptionalism and reassuring the Mormon populace of Mormon normalcy. Look at the Articles of Faith. We're just like you. We believe in God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost. But we don't believe in original sin. We believe in the Bible. Well, we also believe in the Book of Mormon. And it goes back and forth, right? Well, when Parley comes to defend the church in 1838, when he writes his response to Leroy Sunderland, there's no compromise about it. There's no attempt to convince anybody that Mormons are just like you. Because in Parley's perspective, Christianity is the Titanic, and it's sinking. Why would we want to swim back to the Titanic? That's Parley's attitude. He's contentious, he's feisty, he's proud of Mormon difference, and that's what he celebrates. And as I said, that seems to be a course of action strategy that hasn't, by and large, been embraced. I sometimes think, you know, when the question comes up, are Mormons Christian? Right? And in my mind, I see Peter and Paul in the cave outside of Jerusalem. And Peter is saying to Paul, they're saying we're not Jews. And Paul says, maybe we need a new name. How about Christian? And I sometimes imagine Parley having this conversation with himself. Well, if Christian means to be like them, thank heavens we're not, right? So it wouldn't have concerned him in the least that we were excluded from that kind of boys' club of other Christians. But anyhow, that's one of the things that I admire about Pratt, was his fierce, independent spirit and streak. But I also came to admire the man because, as I said, he lived with this inner tragedy, feeling that Zion had not quite fulfilled its potential, and yet he remained faithful nonetheless to the tradition that he so loved. Thank you.
I do want to open it up to questions, and I'm going to ask the first one. But first, I want to apologize for neglecting to tell you about Matt's book. Terryl said it really wasn't worth mentioning, so. I know, I heard him. Liberty to the Downtrodden, Thomas L. Kane, Romantic Reformer, and that was published by Yale. He has another book coming out, Parley P. Pratt and the Making of Mormonism, from the Arthur H. Clarke Company, and that'll be, is it December? On his writings. And
well, it's an edited compilation, kind of growing out of a conference 3 or 4 years ago, that has essays by people like Jan Shipps and Rick Turley and David Whitaker, and 10 essays in it on Pratt's place in early Mormonism, a bunch of different perspectives.
I'm going to ask the first question, and I'm going to be very interested to see if either of our authors can tell us verbatim the title of Pratt's response to Sunderland. Can either of you do it?
Mormonism Unveiled or Zion's Watchmen Unmasked.
Keep going.
Any title in the 19th century goes on for 3 pages. Even I can't do that.
Okay, you want to hear the whole thing? It would be hard. He was right. Mormonism Unveiled, Zion's Watchman Unmasked, and its editor, Mr. L.R. Sunderland, exposed, truth vindicated, the devil mad, and priestcraft in danger. That's the whole pamphlet. We don't have that. That's very rare and important. But, okay, let's open it up to questions. I'll let you guys field them as you want to.
I'm interested in how Brigham Young actually got along with Parley Pratt and Orson Pratt, and if he was kind of stuck in the middle of that relationship. You guys studied that at all?
I don't think he ever got involved in the Orson Brigham controversies, but he had a number of run-ins himself with Brigham, and I'll let Matt talk about those. So Sec, you can. That was his part.
I mean, in general, the relationship between Brigham and Parley is much smoother than the relationship between Brigham and Orson. But yeah, I mean, certainly there's some significant bumps in the road. One of them, for instance, was on the Trek West, where Brigham, of course, led the initial pioneer company, and Parley Pratt and John Taylor led the much larger company that crossed the plains that year. And Brigham had initially intended for Pratt and Taylor to come on that initial pioneer company. They had just come home from a mission and refused to go. And then not only did they refuse to go, but they reorganized the companies that Brigham had thought he had organized. They took issue with how well they were organized, and so by the time they get to the cross pass, as Brigham is returning from Utah near South Pass of Wyoming, and Brigham lets him have it for a few days. And so there are those kinds of.
Pratt is contrite.
Yeah, he actually he defends himself initially like he does during the Kirtland Bank crisis with Joseph Smith, but then he does have this kind of ability to be very contrite and to make amends. Theologically, Brigham doesn't seem to have controversies with Parley. I mean, he I think very much appreciates Pratt's works, often recommends them to people in letters and things like that.
For the tape, keep in mind, we want everybody to hear in the back, and also for the tape, if you could ask your question loudly. If we need to, maybe you could restate it, but
Okay.
And I need you two to project all the way back there.
Will do.
Okay.
In your research, did you run into any interaction between William Miller and his followers and Parley Pratt? Was that a relevant factor in Parley Pratt's teaching?
Not really. I mean, certainly it's part of the background for any millennialist, right, in the late 1830s, 1840s. Pratt doesn't seem to engage with it all that much.
There's some articles in the church paper, some articles that come out of the church paper that discredit the Millerites, but I don't know of anything more specific than that. And I don't
So they essentially were parallel movements not talking to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least from Parley Pratt's perspective, there's not much involvement. I mean, if you look at the broader Mormon movement, I mean...
Oh, yeah, I got that.
Yeah, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know about Orson and Parley's tiffs at times, like the 1845 temple expulsion thing, but theologically, did they differ from each other in any substantial ways?
No, in fact, it's very hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And there's some really lovely letters that come from Orson to Parley at the time of their reconciliation, in which Orson is effusive in his praise for Parley's writing, and tells him how influential his writing and ideas have been in his own. And it's as if, as Parley is leaving the stage, Orson steps onto it. Because other than his great masterwork, The Key to the Science of Theology, which he's working on for a number of years, Parley really isn't that active in the latter part of his life. And that's when Orson effectively steps in and fills the void, from 1852 on especially.
Please.
Why did Parley go to Chile to introduce the gospel to Spanish-speaking instead of to Mexico?
Well, that's where Lehi landed.
I was afraid you were going to say that because my son here believes it.
It's a more complicated answer, but the question is why Chile rather than Mexico as the first mission to Latin America? And there's several reasons to that question. First of all, Parley's on a mission Gold Rush San Francisco, and he goes to Chile. There's lots of Chileans in the Gold Rush, and there's very active commerce between San Francisco and Chile. So if you're asking where can I get in Latin America from San Francisco, there's not that many ports which ships are going to frequently. So that's one of the reasons. But another of the reasons really was this theological idea that Lehi landed in Chile, and that he would there kind of find a more receptive people. Once he's in Chile, he actually wishes that he'd gone to Peru, because at the time Peru has more liberal laws about religious tolerance than does Chile. And as he's in Chile and he's realizing this, he kind of wishes he'd gone to Peru, and he makes that recommendation for future missionaries.
Thank you.
Please.
When did Joseph Smith first tell Parley Pratt about these visions in his youth, and what was his reaction when he heard that story?
We don't know exactly when. We know that Parley was completely confused about the first vision account because there's a letter probably written in 1837 by Parley Pratt in which he confuses the story of Moroni and the story of the first vision. And that's 1837.
Yeah.
We think that letter is dated. And shortly thereafter, he's telling the story and getting it exactly right. And he also makes reference in a letter to John Taylor that Joseph is coming to Kirtland. There's great excitement because he's going to talk about his visions. And so our assumption, our reading of that, is that it's probably in 1837 that Joseph talks more about his first vision, what we call his first vision. Parley gets it straightened out at that point in time and never again confuses the two. But it's also very significant, I think, to point out that when Parley writes his first version, his first edition of Voice of Warning in 1837, Joseph Smith's name nowhere appears in this book. Starting with a second edition, it does. But that could reflect, in part, a kind of lingering unease in the relationship because they'd had that very bitter falling out earlier in 1837. It could reflect the fact that the way that the Restoration was originally understood by this generation of missionaries and writers was that it wasn't about Joseph Smith. He was almost of secondary importance as an individual, other than being the instrument through whom, right, angelic administrations and restoration of priesthood authority occurred.
And just one other thought on that is, Parley, of course, has this very famous conversion experience with the Book of Mormon, right? And in a really, in a very real way, he's the first kind of Book of Mormon convert, where he doesn't know any Mormons at the time. The church in September 1830 is 4 or 5 dozen members, kind of the Smiths, the extended, and a few other extended family clans. And he's kind of the prototype for a new type of convert, someone who isn't associated with that New York group at all, but who encounters a copy of the Book of Mormon and becomes converted.
Isn't that indicative of how easy it was for people at that time to believe that the American Indians had Hebraic origins? Did that indicate that to you?
I mean, certainly Parley is very interested in this question about the origins of the American Indians.
Well, there were books written about it.
Well,
Sure.
sure. And that is one of the reasons that I think the Book of Mormon resonates with him. I mean, there's other theological reasons as well, but that's one of them.
Why were Parley's fundamental ideas of theology accepted? What enabled him to put them into this sacred text, and they were so widely accepted and so fundamental?
I think part of it was just his style. I mean, today we read Parley and we think, Victorian excess and hyperbole. But within the context of 19th century writing conventions, he was very gifted. He was very literary. He considered himself a man of letters, and effectively he was. And I think it was the first time that anybody had made a presentation other than in the kind of wooden, almost pedestrian presentation that other tracts typically employ. So it was just the best presentation of Joseph Smith's ideas that was available at the time.
This is for Matt.
Okay.
You mentioned that Parley reveled in persecution.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what how far that reveling goes. Do you think that he ever made some situations worse, or sought out situations just to be persecuted?
Well, I don't think he's necessarily seeking out the persecution, but he doesn't avoid it either. You know, and one example of kind of his style, particularly I think in his early life, is a mission that he goes on to the Shakers, the one from the Doctrine and Covenants, right? So he is sent with Sidney Rigdon and Lehman Copley, who was a Shaker and then he converted to Mormonism, you know, they take the revelation, they ask to read it to the Shakers, and the account that we have is from a Shaker elder, you know, they read the revelation, the Shaker elder dismisses it, and Parley presses the point and says, you know, let's take a vote on it, and the Shakers vote against the revelation, and he begins to really kind of berate the ministry. I mean, you know, kind of get into it with the Shaker elder, who is a very forceful personality in his own right, kind of, at the end of the experience, Sidney Rigdon is kind of sitting there quietly. Lehman Copley is weeping for the beating he's taken, and Parley Pratt is dusting off his coattails and leaving in a huff. So, you know, I mean, he does have this very brash side to him. I mean, so he's not going to avoid the confrontation.
Let me just add another incident that I think rounds out the picture even more. The most famous story that Pratt probably tells is the Bulldog incident, right? And you may remember that that's associated with his mission to the Lamanites, and they're passing through the Kirtland area. And he tells us in the autobiography that he was arrested while preaching the Book of Mormon on a trivial charge. And it's all religious persecution, right? And he talks about the night, right? The kind of back and forth with the jailers, and they're persecuting him for his beliefs, and he's telling them they need to repent. And, well, as I'm working on this section of the biography, it occurred to me that there were a few things that didn't quite fit together, right? Pratt is on this mission with 4 others. They picked up Frederick G. Williams along the way. So there are 5 of them preaching the Book of Mormon. Why is only Pratt arrested? Pratt tends to be pretty good about the details. Why doesn't he tell us exactly what the frivolous charge is? And then the third red flag was, wait a minute, Parley lived in this area the year before. So I called Matt and I said, Matt, what can we find court records for that day and time and place? And he gets back with me later the day with a newspaper account. Well, Parley was arrested for fleeing his debts. He wasn't arrested for anything that had to do with preaching the Book of Mormon or religion at all. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that Pratt is completely reconstructing a story, changing the facts in order to make himself out a religious martyr when really he's just financially irresponsible? Maybe. I tend to think, though, that Pratt really did see Satan at work behind these ostensibly legal, right, maneuvers, because the most important thing from his perspective was, as a minister of the gospel, his mission is interrupted. And he's being detained, and it must really be because he's a Mormon preaching the Book of Mormon. So I think that colored his perception.
Yeah, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the Battle of Crooked River.
Okay.
Some people have taken exception to Parley's description and accuracy, almost a Mormon version of whether or not Henry Greedo shot first, maybe.
Yeah.
Do you deal with the Battle of Crooked River controversy, and what is your take on that?
You know, we do deal with it. The records are very confused. It's hard to really know what happened, right? Besides, you know, I mean, who fires first? Who knows, right? And at the end of the day, we know that a few people on each side are lying there dead or wounded. And of course, that's the charge under which Parley is then arrested under. And all the Crooked River participants are being held for murder because one of the Missourians died during the battle. Most of them have the good sense to get out of far west before the city is encircled, but Parley doesn't. And that actually comes back much later in the life, in the story that leads up to his death, where Hector McLean, who is in this kind of manhunt for him, has him arrested, and the idea is not to try him on the charge which he's arrested for, which is actually stealing the clothes that Ellen McLean's children were wearing, but to get him back to Missouri, where he's still a fugitive from justice. I think the charges are still good there.
So we try to include the documents that are relevant on both sides and show that there are some problems with the reliability of some of the documents.
Yeah, but we don't solve the mystery of who shot first.
With Pratt's flair for the dramatic, did you ever encounter instances where you wrestled with perhaps exaggerations and wondered if they were the truth, or simply take things with a grain of salt?
Well, probably the prime candidate for suspicion is his story of Joseph in chains in Richmond jail. There are no other accounts or reports of that, although there is some language from the Doctrine and Covenants that is evocative of Parley Pratt's version. So I personally think that it's slightly embellished, but authentic. Other than that, I can't think of any other particular episodes that we had cause to suspect, although there were from time to time discrepancies between the historical record and Pratt's, usually minor, but sometimes in his own records. For example, when he talks about coming back, it's during one of the Missouri episodes, he comes back late at night, there are mobbers in the vicinity, he sneaks home, makes his way to his cabin, gets his wife, puts her on the horse and rides to safety. But when he later retells that story in his account of the Missouri persecutions, he says he was too afraid to go to the cabin, he flees to the river and sends a friend back to get her, which he does, and then rides her to safety. But at least in that case, he is correcting his own narrative. But
yeah, no. So I mean, I think with any historical figure, right? I mean, you need to be suspicious of approach the historical evidence with some skepticism, and so I think that was our general approach, right? I mean, how does what he's saying in his autobiography, which is written in the mid-1850s, how does that conform with other records from the time? And in general, I think we found it to be quite accurate, quite authentic. And certainly, like any historical figure, you would expect some discrepancies in accounts that are made at different times.
My question may go a little bit beyond the scope of your book, but in Mormon Rebellion, David Bigler and Will Bagley talk about Eleanor McLean coming into Salt Lake City and inflaming people that were there, and they feel that this is a direct contribution to Mountain Meadows.
Right.
Have you fellows looked at that at all?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that kind of drawing a causal linkage between Eleanor and the Mountain Meadows massacre is very much overstated. Actually, in the edited volume coming out from Arthur Clarke, Rick Turley kind of looks at all the evidence, and that's his argument, and I think it's a good argument. I mean, ever since the massacre, within 3 weeks of the massacre, I mean, there are people connecting Parley Pratt's death in Arkansas with the massacre of these Arkansans in Utah, right? I mean, it makes all the sense in the world to an outside observer, right? You have this Mormon apostle killed in Arkansas. Of course, that's why these Arkansans are killed in Utah. But if you look at what people in southern Utah are saying and talking and thinking about, you don't get much Parley Pratt, right? I mean, I think it forms part of the general backdrop of the Utah War crisis and of what leads up to Mountain Meadows. But I think this kind of direct causal linkage, especially with Eleanor, you know, in their telling, Eleanor arrives is kind of this very dramatic moment in which she tells the story of the death of Parley Pratt. But they've known about Parley's death for 6 weeks by the time Eleanor gets there. I mean, it isn't the same kind of... And certainly Eleanor does get there, and she's very distraught, she's upset, she's talking to people about it. But so in general, I would say that's very much overblown.
Why Oxford, and why does Oxford want to publish a book about Parley P. Pratt? And it seems like they're doing quite a bit in Mormonism now. And just, what's your take on all that?
I don't know, but I don't want to ask too many questions.
I think why is this? There's interest, right? And it comes down to, I think people like Terryl have led the way and produced very solid scholarship for Oxford that has also proven to be marketable. So I think it's those two things.
Some of these books have made them money, and that's important to a publisher. It really is. I don't say that lightly. It's true.
Is this book intended to a Mormon audience, or do you think
No,
just
no.
to a general?
To a general audience.
I mean, one difference between this book and most of what Oxford has done is this is in their trade division, which means that they think it has kind of broader possibilities and a broader audience and that kind of thing. So.
When Parley returned from Chile, my understanding, but I don't have the documentation in my head, is that he was very intent on learning Spanish.
Yep.
And even pronounced, we are going to create a book to teach our young elders how to speak Spanish, the beginning of the language training mission. But then nothing happened. Did you delve into that? I mean, did Helaman Pratt get training from his father on Spanish before he went to Mexico, or?
Yeah, you know, this is something that actually, again, in this edited book later this year, someone takes on this question. That we deal with somewhat, but not a whole lot. When Parley gets home from Chile, he gives this great mission, or this great kind of mission report in the Tabernacle. And one of the exciting things about what we were able to do is there are many sermons that exist in the church archives in shorthand that we've never known about. And Legine Caruth, who's an expert in shorthand, transcribed those sermons for us. And this is one of those sermons. And at the end of the sermon, he says, "You can consider Brother Parley on a Spanish mission." I mean, he's saying, I'm not done with Spanish. And he does...
Spanish was done with him.
But Spanish was done with him. I mean, he writes this short pamphlet in Spanish, right, that you can tell where his translation ends and a more competent translator begins. But, you know, he does have this idea, you know, he tells Brigham, if each of the 12 were to take one language and become expert in it, that's kind of what we need to do.
But I was just saying,
Yep.
part of the backstory here is we found a little small, just one entry in Wilford Woodruff's journal at the time the School of the Prophets is going on, where he says, bought a Latin grammar from Parley for $1. So
Parley was in the Latin class, but apparently didn't
he dropped
excel.
out.
But then there does, you know, with Helaman Pratt, who goes to Mexico in the 1870s, there's this kind of connection with the Pratt family with Latin America, and then Helaman's son, Ray Lucero Pratt, is a very important 70 who is involved in Argentina.
They each look back to Parley, saying,
Absolutely.
we are filling our grandfather and grandfather's
Absolutely.
legacy.
We just have time for one more question,
Okay.
so if you haven't asked a question yet, what do you quick?
Yeah, well, my question was, when I was reading your book, it sounds like that Parley came from a poor family and with little education, so how did the two brothers learn how to write so well?
I think, like so many other people of that generation, they were just autodidacts. They read a lot. With Orson, we get more of a sense of the influences behind his writing. With Parley, at least I wasn't able to derive or intuit any particular influences in his thinking or writing. And that's, I think, because largely he was a polemical writer, whereas Orson was a more kind of metaphysically oriented writer. But yes, the family was very, very poor. There are indications that they even took in a boarder. The children were farmed out at very, very early ages. Their father was thrown out of work, probably because of the reverberations of the Industrial Revolution that threw so many weavers. He was just, you know, like Silas Marner. So I don't know where he's getting his books and his learning, but he assimilates a lot, obviously, from that area.
Did you have access to all the sources?
Well, we had access to a lot of sources, to hundreds of letters, but of course many of the original sources disappeared a long time ago. So with Parley, you're dealing with
The known sources, did you?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely
Pretty much got all of them.
used all the known sources and all the archives. Yeah, there weren't access type issues for existing sources.
Thank you very much for